You have until 5 o'clock to remove your personal belongings, Mr. Mercer. After that, the farmhouse belongs to the association." Vanessa Whitmore said those words while standing beside a polished black luxury sport utility vehicle at the end of my gravel driveway, holding a cream-colored folder like she was delivering an invitation instead of telling me I had lost control of the house my family had owned for nearly 70 years. Behind her, someone had already replaced the lock on the front door. I stopped about 20 feet from the porch and stared at the brass cylinder where my old lock had been that morning. "My name is Caleb Mercer. I am 42 years old, and that farmhouse sat on 36 acres outside a gated community called Silver Pines Estates. My grandfather bought the property when the nearest neighbor was almost a mile away. My father grew corn behind the barn, repaired tractors under the old maple tree, and spent Sunday mornings drinking coffee on the porch. Silver Pines did not exist back then. Neither did its stone entrance, private clubhouse, decorative fountains, or homeowners association. Yet Vanessa, the association president, was standing on my land telling me they had taken control of my home over unpaid fees. She wore an expensive-looking bright purple jacket, oversized gold jewelry, and sunglasses with thick jeweled frames. Everything about her looked designed to announce authority before she opened her mouth. "There has to be a mistake," I said. Vanessa smiled. "The mistake was ignoring your obligations." She opened the folder and handed me several pages. According to the statement, I owed $900 in assessments, followed by late charges, administrative costs, collection expenses, and legal fees that had pushed the claim balance into several $1,000s. I had seen earlier notices from Silver Pines. I had answered them in writing every time. My farmhouse was not part of their association. I had never signed membership documents, paid dues, used their clubhouse, or received access to their private amenities. More importantly, the Mercer property existed decades before Silver Pines Estates was developed. "You cannot charge association fees to property outside the association," I said. Vanessa lowered her sunglasses just enough to look over them. "That argument has already been considered." "By whom?" "Our attorneys." I looked toward my porch. The rocking chair my father built was still beside the front window. Nothing about the scene felt dramatic from the road. No shouting, no crowd, just a locked door, a quiet field, and a woman holding paperwork that claimed decades of family ownership had somehow become secondary to an organization created long after the house was built. That was what bothered me most. Vanessa seemed completely comfortable. She expected me to panic, pay whatever number appeared on the page, or walk away believing there was nothing left to challenge. Instead, I read every line. Near the bottom was the legal name behind Silver Pines Estates Homeowners Association. Beneath it was another entity connected to the original development, Westbridge Residential Development, Limited Liability Company. I knew that name. I could not immediately remember why, but I had seen it before. Not on an HOA notice. Not on anything Vanessa had mailed me. I had seen it years earlier in my father's office, printed across a thick stack of documents he kept inside a gray metal file box. Before he died, he told me never to throw that box away, even if the papers looked outdated. Vanessa tapped the folder. 5 o'clock, Mr. Mercer. I looked at her, then at the replaced lock, and finally back at the name Westbridge Residential Development. For the first time that afternoon, losing access to the farmhouse was no longer the only thing on my mind. I wanted to know why the company that built Vanessa's gated community was sitting inside paperwork my father had protected for decades. I handed the folder back to her. "I understand what you're claiming," I said. Her smile returned. "Good. Then this should be simple." She turned toward her vehicle, apparently satisfied that the conversation was over. I stayed beside the driveway, looking past the farmhouse toward the distant stone gates of Silver Pines. Vanessa thought she had just shown me the document that ended my fight. She had actually shown me where to start looking. I left Vanessa at the driveway and drove straight to my attorney's office, carrying nothing but my phone, the photographs I had taken of the new lock, and copies of every notice Silver Pines had mailed me. Daniel Brooks had handled property matters for my family for nearly 12 years, and when I placed the latest paperwork on his desk, he did not tell me everything would be fine. He read it twice, leaned back, and said, "Before we argue about what they did, we need to establish what they were ever allowed to do." That was exactly the question I wanted answered. My farmhouse had never felt connected to Silver Pines because, historically, it was not. My grandfather purchased the original Mercer property in 1957, when that part of the county was mostly farmland divided by narrow roads and fence lines. By the time my father inherited it, the family owned nearly 400 acres. In the late 1990s, developers began buying large parcels nearby. My father eventually sold most of our western acreage, but he kept the farmhouse, the barn, 36 acres surrounding them, and a narrow strip connecting the property to the county road. Silver Pines Estates began construction years later. Its first homes appeared beyond our western tree line, followed by more houses, landscaped entrances, a clubhouse, and eventually the gates Vanessa seemed so proud of controlling. I had never objected to the development. Most residents were decent people who waved when they passed me at the feed store or saw me repairing fence near the road. The problem began after Vanessa became association president. Within months, I received a letter welcoming me as though my property had somehow joined Silver Pines overnight. The letter included a $900 annual assessment. I responded with a copy of my deed and asked them to identify the recorded declaration that bound my 36 acres to their association. They sent another invoice. I asked again. Then came a late notice. Daniel pulled up county property records while I sat across from him. The legal description for my parcel matched the deed I already had. My property line stopped before the residential lots began. That helps, Daniel said. But location alone is not enough. We need the declaration, amendments, subdivision records, and anything recorded when your father sold the surrounding acreage. The next morning, we went to the county records office. I expected the answer to be simple. Instead, we found layers of documents created over nearly 3 decades. Silver Pines had expanded in phases, and each phase came with plats, declarations, amendments, easements, and transfers between business entities. We traced parcel numbers until my eyes hurt. By early afternoon, Daniel placed 2 documents beside each other. One was the original Silver Pines declaration. The other was the legal description of my retained property. My farmhouse parcel was not listed among the lots subjected to the declaration. Neither was the barn. Neither were the surrounding 36 acres. I felt relief for about 3 seconds. Then Daniel pointed to a later amendment Vanessa's attorneys appeared to be relying on. It contained language suggesting additional property could become subject to association obligations under certain conditions. Attached to it was a map showing later development phases surrounding my land. My parcel sat in the middle like an island. Does this include me? I asked. Not by itself, Daniel said. They still need something connecting your parcel to this declaration. That afternoon, I sent Vanessa a formal written request asking for the exact recorded instrument she believed made my farmhouse part of Silver Pines. No arguments. No accusations. Just one question and a request for the document. Her response arrived before dinner. She did not provide a deed restriction, signed agreement, or recorded annexation specific to my parcel. Instead, she wrote that the association's position had already been reviewed and that I should direct future communication to its counsel. I read the message twice. Vanessa had been confident enough to replace my lock, yet when I asked her to show me the document giving the association authority over my land, she gave me everything except that document. That was when I stopped wondering whether I had misunderstood Silver Pines and started wondering what Vanessa was trying so hard not to explain. The next letter arrived 3 days later, and the $900 Vanessa originally claimed I owed had somehow become $4,860. I stood in Daniel's office reading the breakdown while he compared it with the earlier notices. There were late charges, administrative fees, document preparation costs, collection expenses, and attorney fees. The strangest part was not the total. It was how quickly the total had grown while the association still had not shown us the recorded document that supposedly placed my farmhouse inside Silver Pines. Daniel told me not to call Vanessa. From that point forward, everything needed to be documented. So I created a timeline. I started with the first assessment notice, added my written response, attached my deed, recorded the dates of every follow-up letter, and saved Vanessa's message refusing to identify the specific instrument binding my land to the association. By the end of the evening, the folder was nearly an inch thick. The pattern became easier to see once everything was arranged by date. Every time I disputed their authority, they answered with another charge instead of proof. A week later, I received a certified letter from the association's law firm stating that the claimed balance had increased again. It warned that continued non-payment could lead to enforcement against the property. Daniel read it carefully and sent a response disputing the debt and requesting the legal basis for every assessment. The answer we received included copies of the Silver Pines Declaration, several amendments, board resolutions, and accounting statements. There were dozens of pages, but still nothing showing that my father or I had agreed to place the retained Mercer parcel under the association. Then Vanessa came to the farm again. I was repairing a loose hinge on the barn door when her vehicle stopped near the driveway. She stepped out wearing a bright red coat, large sunglasses, and enough gold jewelry to catch the afternoon sun from 50 feet away. "You are making this much more expensive than necessary," she said. I set the wrench on my workbench. "Then show me the document." Her expression tightened. "Our attorneys have already provided the governing records." They provided records for Silver Pines. I asked for the record that includes my parcel. She crossed her arms. "Your property benefits from the community." I looked toward the distant stone entrance. "I use the county road. I have no gate access, no clubhouse privileges, no association landscaping, and no community services. Property values do not stop at a boundary line, Mr. Mercer." That sentence told me more than she probably intended. Vanessa was no longer explaining why I legally owed the money. She was explaining why she believed I should owe it. Those were two very different things. I asked her one final time whether she could identify the recorded instrument attaching my farmhouse to Silver Pines. She told me the matter was in the hands of counsel and walked back to her vehicle. That evening, Daniel called with worse news. The association had taken another formal step based on its claimed debt, creating a cloud over the title that could become far more serious if we did not challenge it correctly. He cautioned me that property disputes moved through procedures, not dramatic confrontations. We needed records, deadlines, and evidence. I spent the next several days doing exactly that. I photographed every notice, copied every envelope, downloaded county records, and built a spreadsheet showing how $900 had multiplied into thousands. Then I noticed something buried in one of the association's older exhibits. The same Westbridge residential development name from Vanessa's paperwork appeared beside a reference to the original land transaction with my father. It was only one line, but it connected the current dispute to something that had happened long before Vanessa became president. I called Daniel and read it to him. He was silent for a moment. "Caleb, find your father's records." I looked toward the farmhouse I could no longer freely enter and remembered the gray metal file box. The problem was that the box was still inside. The gray metal file box was sitting less than 40 feet from where I stood, but I was not going to give Vanessa the satisfaction of claiming I had ignored the legal process to retrieve it. Daniel arranged a supervised access window through the association's attorney while he prepared the challenge to their claim. 2 mornings later, I returned to the farmhouse with Daniel beside me. Vanessa was already there near the porch, wearing a bright emerald jacket, oversized sunglasses, and a gold necklace that looked more appropriate for a hotel ballroom than a gravel driveway. She checked her watch when we arrived. 30 minutes, she said. Daniel answered before I could. "We understand the arrangement." Walking through my own front door under someone else's conditions felt stranger than I expected. The house looked exactly as I had left it. My coffee mug was beside the sink. My father's old clock was ticking above the kitchen doorway. Yet every minute inside was being measured by people who claimed I owed them money without proving why. I went directly to the small office behind the living room. The gray box was under the bottom shelf of my father's oak desk. I lifted it onto the desktop and opened it. Inside were tax records, surveys, correspondence, closing papers, and contracts from the years when my father sold acreage west of the farmhouse. Daniel started sorting while I checked the labels on each folder. Then I found one marked WESTBRIDG. The first pages looked ordinary: maps, purchase agreements, engineering correspondence, and notes about access roads. But deeper in the folder was a document bearing the name Mercer Holdings. I remembered my father using that company for certain property transactions, although I had never paid much attention to the details. Daniel turned several pages, stopped, then went back to the beginning. "Take the whole box," he said quietly. "Why?" "Because your father did more than sell land." Before he could explain, Vanessa called from the hallway that our time was nearly finished. Daniel closed the folder. We carried the box outside without arguing. Vanessa watched us cross the porch and smiled as though she had already won. I hope you found whatever personal items you needed. I did, I said. That afternoon, Daniel and I spent hours reconstructing the transaction. Westbridge had purchased a large portion of my father's acreage during the early development period, but the sale was only one part of the deal. Mercer Holdings had remained connected to the project through separate financial agreements. We did not yet know which rights had survived or whether any had transferred to me, but one thing was immediately clear. My father had negotiated protections for the farmhouse parcel before the first Silver Pines home was built. Then Daniel found the language that made him sit forward. The retained 36 acres were specifically identified as excluded property in an agreement tied to the original development structure. It was not yet enough to solve everything, but it directly contradicted the story Vanessa had been telling. I looked at the signature page and recognized my father's handwriting. For weeks, Vanessa had treated my farmhouse like an inconvenient parcel that Silver Pines had eventually absorbed. My father had anticipated that possibility decades earlier and put the boundary into writing. Daniel kept reading. A few pages later, he stopped again. There is more here, Caleb. The agreement referenced a financing arrangement involving Westbridge, Mercer Holdings, and future development obligations. I asked whether it still mattered after all these years. Daniel looked at the stack of documents, then at me. I do not know yet. But before Vanessa decided your farmhouse belonged to Silver Pines, she probably should have learned who helped finance Silver Pines in the first place. Daniel spent the next 2 days tracing every company named in my father's files, and what emerged was far more complicated than a land sale. When Westbridge Residential Development began assembling property for Silver Pines, the company had enough capital to purchase land, but not enough flexible financing to complete every phase it planned. My father saw an opportunity. Instead of taking the entire purchase price in cash, Mercer Holdings accepted part of the transaction through a private financing structure tied to development milestones. Over the years, portions were repaid, refinanced, or transferred, but several contractual rights remained attached to Mercer Holdings. After my father died, ownership of that company had passed to me along with the farm. I had known I inherited the business entity. I had assumed it was little more than an old container for property records and residual income. I had been wrong. Daniel brought in a commercial finance attorney named Rebecca Sloan to review the documents. She arrived carrying a legal pad and spent nearly 3 hours reading before saying anything definite. First, you do not own the homeowner's mortgages, she said. You cannot cancel their home loans, and nothing here gives you control over individual residents. I nodded. I had no interest in punishing people who had nothing to do with Vanessa's decisions. Rebecca turned to another agreement. But Mercer Holdings retained rights connected to a private credit facility established for the development structure. It was modified several times as Silver Pines expanded. She explained that later agreements had preserved certain commitments involving infrastructure reserves, common property improvements, and future credit availability. The documents were dense, but the principle was simple. Silver Pines had grown around financing arrangements created long before Vanessa became president, and one surviving piece of that structure still depended on contractual obligations originally negotiated with my father. Rebecca was careful not to promise that we controlled anything until she verified every amendment and assignment. That caution made me trust her more. By Friday afternoon, she had traced the relevant documents through county filings, corporate records, and the papers in the gray box. Then she called Daniel and me into the conference room. On the table was a chain of agreements stretching across more than 20 years. This is the important part, she said. Mercer Holdings still held the position necessary to approve certain extensions and future commitments under the remaining private facility. Silver Pines was not depending on it to keep the lights on tomorrow morning, but the association and related development entities had continued using that financing structure for planned common area projects and obligations. I stared at the paperwork. So I can shut down their financing? Rebecca shook her head. Not because you are angry, and not whenever you feel like it. Contracts do not work that way. Your rights depend on the terms, notice requirements, and whether a qualifying breach occurred. Then she opened the original agreement my father had signed. The retained Mercer property appeared again, described separately from the development land. The farmhouse, barn, 36 acres, and access strip had been deliberately carved out. That exclusion was not hidden in a forgotten map. It was part of the financial bargain that helped Westbridge move forward. Suddenly, Vanessa's claim looked different. She had not merely sent bills to the wrong address. Her association was asserting authority over property that the original development documents had specifically protected. Rebecca told us she needed to compare that protection with the later amendments before deciding whether Vanessa's actions affected the financing agreement. I thought about the new lock on my front door and the thousands of dollars in fees created from an assessment I had disputed from the beginning. For the first time, I understood why my father had guarded that gray box so carefully. He had not expected me to use old paperwork as a weapon. He had expected someone, someday, to forget the limits written into the deal. Rebecca turned one final page and placed her finger beside a paragraph near the bottom. "Caleb," she said, "I think this is the clause your father wanted you to keep." Rebecca kept her finger beside the paragraph while Daniel moved his chair closer to the table. The language was dense, written for attorneys and lenders rather than farmers. But after Rebecca walked me through it, the purpose became clear. My father had agreed to support Westbridge's development financing only after securing protections for the property he intended to keep. The farmhouse parcel could not be treated as development property, burdened with association obligations created for Silver Pines, or used to support community liabilities unless Mercer Holdings expressly agreed in writing. There was also a covenant requiring successor entities benefiting from the financing structure to respect those exclusions. "That does not automatically mean Vanessa breached this agreement," Rebecca said. "We have to connect the association's actions to an entity bound by these obligations, and we have to follow the notice provisions exactly." That distinction mattered. I did not want a clever technicality. I wanted to know whether the people claiming authority over my farmhouse actually had it. Rebecca spent the weekend tracing amendments while Daniel prepared our challenge to the association's property claim. On Monday morning, they called me back. Rebecca had built a diagram showing how Westbridge's original obligations moved through several entities as Silver Pines expanded. The names changed, but certain financing rights and covenants survived. More importantly, documents executed during a later development phase connected the association to obligations involving common property and the protected boundaries established in the original agreements. Vanessa could not erase those boundaries simply because the neighborhood eventually surrounded my land. Daniel pointed to my deed, then to the original exclusion. "Your 36 acres never became an association parcel through any document we have found." Rebecca added another page. "And the association's attempt to impose assessments on this parcel may conflict with a covenant tied to the facility. Their effort to enforce those assessments makes the issue much more serious." I asked what happened next. Rebecca did not say we could immediately terminate anything. Instead, she showed me the notice section. If a qualifying breach occurred, the responsible parties had to receive formal written notice and a defined opportunity to cure it. Only after that period expired could Mercer Holdings exercise specific contractual rights involving undrawn commitments, extensions, and future credit availability. "So they get a chance to fix this," I said. "Absolutely," she replied. "That is how you protect your position." That afternoon, Daniel sent the association a separate demand concerning my farmhouse, while Rebecca prepared notice under the financing agreements. The documents identified the protected parcel, cited the relevant covenant, described the disputed assessments and enforcement actions, and requested corrective action. No threats, no dramatic language, just dates, records, obligations, and a deadline. Vanessa responded the next morning. She called the entire theory an attempt to intimidate the board with obsolete documents and insisted the association would continue its enforcement process. Then she scheduled a board meeting for Thursday evening and invited Daniel and me to attend. Rebecca came too. Before the meeting, we stopped at the edge of my property. From there I could see the roof of the farmhouse through the trees and, farther west, the stone pillars marking the Silver Pines entrance. My father had sold land that helped make those streets possible, but he had drawn a line around the place he wanted our family to keep. Vanessa had spent weeks pretending that line did not matter. Thursday evening, we entered the Silver Pines clubhouse carrying 3 binders. Vanessa sat at the center of a long table wearing a bright blue designer jacket and a jeweled brooch, with 6 board members seated around her. She looked at the binders and smiled. "Mr. Mercer, I hope we can finally put this behind us." So do I said. Daniel placed my deed on the table. Rebecca placed the financing agreement beside it. Then I set down the formal notice Vanessa had dismissed. Her smile faded slightly when Rebecca explained that the issue was no longer simply whether Silver Pines could collect a few $1,000s from me. The board had been given an opportunity to correct an action that might place part of its own financial structure at risk. One board member turned toward Vanessa. You told us this parcel was already confirmed as association property. Vanessa straightened in her chair. It was. Rebecca opened the original agreement to the protected property clause. Then this should be easy, she said. Show us the recorded document that changed it. For several seconds, nobody at the table said anything. Vanessa looked at Rebecca, then at the open agreement, as though confidence alone might change the words printed on the page. Finally, she reached for one of the binders her attorney had brought. The association has amendments covering later phases of Silver Pines, she said. We have already reviewed this. Rebecca nodded. Then please identify the amendment that legally subjects the Mercer parcel to the association. Vanessa's attorney began turning pages. He found the same amendment Daniel and I had reviewed at the county records office, the one allowing certain additional property to be brought into Silver Pines under specific conditions. Rebecca read the relevant section aloud, then asked a simple question. Where is the recorded instrument adding Mr. Mercer's 36 acres? The attorney looked down again. One board member leaned forward. Another quietly pulled the copy of my deed closer. Vanessa interrupted before her attorney could answer. The Mercer property sits inside the community boundaries. Geographically surrounded is not the same as legally included, Daniel said. He placed the original subdivision map beside my deed. This parcel existed before Silver Pines. We have found no recorded annexation signed by the owner, no declaration specifically burdening it, and no transfer placing it under association control. Vanessa gave a short laugh. So this entire performance is about a technicality? That was when Rebecca opened the second binder. No, this is about a contractual boundary that helped make the development possible. She walked the board through the original Westbridge transaction, Mercer Holdings, and the protected property covenant. She explained that my father had preserved the farmhouse, barn, access strip, and 36 acres as excluded property when the surrounding land entered the development structure. Then she showed the later agreements carrying certain obligations forward. The room changed. Until that moment, several board members seemed to believe they were watching another homeowner dispute over unpaid assessments. Now they were reading documents connected to financing arrangements supporting projects Silver Pines still planned to use. A board member named Richard Hale asked the question Vanessa had apparently never expected. What financing are we talking about? Rebecca answered carefully. The surviving private facility did not finance individual mortgages and did not control residents' homes. It supported certain development-related obligations, reserves, and planned common area work. Mercer Holdings retained approval rights over specific future commitments and extensions, but those rights could only be exercised according to the contract. And you are saying our action against his property could affect that? Richard asked. We are saying you have received formal notice of a potential qualifying breach, Rebecca replied. The agreement gives the responsible parties an opportunity to cure it. That opportunity is available now. Vanessa pushed her chair back slightly. We are not reversing a valid enforcement action because Mr. Mercer's father signed some old financing agreement. Her attorney turned toward her. Vanessa, we should review the notice before the board takes a position. We already have a position. I had barely spoken during the meeting, and that was intentional. I did not need to outtalk Vanessa. I needed the documents to survive every question she threw at them. I slid the final page across the table. I am not asking Silver Pines for money. I am not asking you to punish residents. I am asking you to remove charges you have never shown apply to my property and correct the enforcement action based on those charges. Richard looked at Vanessa. Can we produce the document he keeps asking for? Vanessa did not answer directly. Instead, she said the association's counsel had previously confirmed its authority. Her attorney looked uncomfortable. I confirmed that the governing documents contained annexation provisions. I did not personally verify a recorded annexation for this specific parcel before the enforcement process began. That sentence landed harder than anything I could have said. Vanessa stared at him. Richard closed his folder. Then why did we proceed? Because the property is clearly part of the community, Vanessa replied. Daniel shook his head. That is an assumption, not a recorded property obligation. Rebecca reminded the board that the cure period was already running. Nothing had to happen that night. They could review the records, withdraw the disputed charges, correct the title issue, restore my access, and preserve their contractual position. It was the cleanest exit Vanessa was going to get. She looked around the table and seemed to realize that everyone was waiting for her. The association will not be pressured by Mercer Holdings, she said. We proceed. Rebecca closed her binder. Then we will follow the agreement. 3 days later, the cure period expired without the association correcting anything. The next morning, Rebecca called me before 8. Silver Pines had submitted a request related to an upcoming extension under the private facility. For years, approval had been routine. This time, the request had arrived while an unresolved contractual breach remained on record. I looked through my kitchen window at the farmhouse in the distance and asked the only question that mattered. Are we legally required to approve it? Rebecca paused. No, Caleb. Not anymore. I did not tell Rebecca to shut down anything that morning. I asked her to explain exactly what refusing the extension would mean, because there was a difference between protecting my contractual rights and using them recklessly. She and Daniel met me at their office an hour later with the financing documents spread across the conference table. Rebecca showed me the request Silver Pines had submitted. The association was not asking Mercer Holdings to fund homeowners' mortgages, utilities, or daily operations. The extension related to future credit commitments connected to reserve-backed common area projects, including planned drainage improvements, road resurfacing, and clubhouse renovations. For years, the required approvals had moved through almost automatically because the contractual conditions remained satisfied. Now one of those conditions was formally disputed, the cure period had expired, and Mercer Holdings was no longer obligated to approve the extension. What happens to the residents if we decline? I asked. Nobody loses a house because of this, Rebecca said. Existing personal mortgages are completely separate. Current obligations remain governed by their own agreements. What changes is access to certain future financing and extensions under this facility. That was enough for me. I signed the notice declining the requested extension while the unresolved breach remained in place. Rebecca sent it through the required channels before noon. We did not announce it. We did not call Vanessa. We simply followed the contract. By late afternoon, the calls started coming to Daniel. Silver Pine's attorney wanted clarification. A representative connected to one of the development entities requested a conference. Then Richard Hale called me directly. Caleb, what happened? He asked. I told him exactly what Rebecca had explained to the board 3 days earlier. The cure period had expired. The disputed enforcement action remained unresolved. Mercer Holdings had declined an extension it was no longer required to approve. Vanessa told us your financing argument was meaningless, Richard said. Then you should ask Vanessa why the extension required our approval, I replied. The next board meeting was scheduled for the following evening. This time, Vanessa was not smiling when I entered the clubhouse. She wore a bright ivory suit, a large jeweled necklace, and the same controlled expression she had used at my driveway, but the room around her felt completely different. Every board member had a copy of Rebecca's notice. Richard spoke first. We need to know whether correcting the Mercer issue resolves the financing problem. Rebecca answered that curing the breach would remove the specific obstacle Mercer Holdings had identified, although any future request would still have to follow the applicable agreements. Vanessa shook her head. So he is holding community projects hostage over $900. No, I said. I disputed $900. Your association turned it into thousands, pursued enforcement against property you could not prove belonged to the association, received formal notice, and refused the opportunity to correct it. Vanessa looked toward her attorney. Tell them we had authority. He chose his words carefully. I cannot currently identify a recorded instrument that annexed the Mercer parcel into Silver Pines. Nobody interrupted him. Richard asked whether the title action should have proceeded without that verification. The attorney said it should be reviewed immediately. Another board member asked why the board had not been told that my father's exclusion was connected to the original development agreements. Vanessa answered that she believed those documents were obsolete. Rebecca slid the current amendment across the table, showing the surviving covenant. They were not. For the first time since the dispute began, Vanessa had no quick response. The board voted to authorize independent review of the assessments, suspend further enforcement related to my parcel, and begin correcting the title issue while the attorneys completed their work. Richard also requested that Vanessa step aside from decisions involving my property until the review was finished. She objected, but the vote carried. 2 days later, Daniel called with confirmation that the association was preparing documents to withdraw its disputed claim. The lock on my farmhouse had not changed yet, and the financing extension had not magically returned. There were still legal steps to complete. But the direction of the entire dispute had reversed without a single resident losing a mortgage or a single family being threatened with their home. Vanessa had tried to turn association fees into leverage against my farmhouse. She had never considered that the farmhouse itself was protected by the agreements beneath the community she governed. And now the same board that once trusted her explanation was asking to see every document she should have read before she ever touched my property. The new lock came off my farmhouse door on a quiet Tuesday morning, almost 6 weeks after Vanessa first stood in my driveway and told me I had lost control of the place. There was no ceremony when Daniel handed me the restored access paperwork. No crowd gathered beside the road. The association had withdrawn the disputed claim, removed the assessments attached to my parcel, and agreed to correct the records created during its enforcement process. After reviewing the chain of title and the original development documents, its independent counsel concluded that Silver Pines could not establish that my 36 acres had ever been legally annexed into the association. The $900 assessment that started everything disappeared with the penalties, administrative charges, collection costs, and legal fees that had followed it. I unlocked the front door and walked into the kitchen. My coffee mug was still beside the sink. My father's clock was still ticking above the doorway. On the surface, almost nothing had changed. But when I entered his office and saw the gray metal file box beneath the shelf, I understood why he had kept those papers for so many years. He had never told me they were a secret weapon. They were not. They were simply a record of the boundaries he had negotiated when Westbridge wanted his land. The farmhouse, barn, access strip, and surrounding acreage were meant to remain outside the development, and he had made that protection part of the agreements supporting the project. Vanessa's mistake was assuming that a gated community eventually became entitled to everything inside the shape of its neighborhood. The board discovered otherwise. Its review found that she had pushed the enforcement process forward without confirming the one document I had requested from the beginning: proof that my parcel was actually subject to Silver Pines. Within days, Vanessa stepped down as association president after the board voted to reorganize its leadership and require additional legal review before future property enforcement actions. Richard Hale temporarily took over board responsibilities while new procedures were adopted. He called me personally and apologized for how far the situation had gone. I told him I did not want an apology from the residents. Most of them had never known there was a dispute until the financing issue reached the board. They had bought homes, paid their assessments, and expected the association to manage common property responsibly. They were not my enemies. That was also why Mercer Holdings did not use its contractual position to punish the community. Once the association corrected the specific breach and the attorneys confirmed the required conditions had been restored, future financing requests could again be considered under the agreements. The extension Vanessa had assumed would be automatic was reviewed properly rather than treated as guaranteed. Some planned projects were delayed while the paperwork was sorted out, but nobody lost a mortgage, nobody lost a home, and Silver Pines remained exactly where it had always been beyond my tree line. A few weeks later, I sat on the porch in the rocking chair my father built and looked west toward the stone entrance of the community. I remembered the first afternoon Vanessa had handed me that cream-colored folder. She thought the most important number inside was the amount she claimed I owed. I thought the most important thing was the lock she had put on my door. We were both wrong. The most important detail was the name Westbridge Residential Development printed near the bottom of the paperwork. That name led me back to my father's file box, then to Mercer Holdings, then to the covenant protecting the farmhouse, and finally to the financing structure Vanessa dismissed without understanding. She had tried to use paperwork as power, but paperwork only works when you read all of it. I never needed to destroy Silver Pines to protect my farm. I only needed the association to respect the same boundary my father had put in writing before its first gate was built. Looking back, what would you have done in my place? Would you have given the board the opportunity to correct its mistake, or would you have taken a harder position after being locked out of your own family home? Share what you think, and if stories about ordinary property owners standing their ground with patience, evidence, and a little preparation keep you listening until the end, subscribe to the channel. There are always more stories behind the gates, but sometimes the most important line is the one drawn long before the gates ever existed.